I don't know how I got given the Father's Day message. I was looking, Reggie and I are the only adult men here that aren't dads yet, and I'll explain why my thinking on that is, for me at least. I don't know about Reggie. So there's literally two adult men here that aren't dads. Like anybody else would have been better to give this message, to do the Father's Day talk, but they gave it to me. I said to Dad last night, "What happened?" He goes, "Yeah, I just didn't notice." And thanks, man. So I don't know how I got given this gig, but here we are. And here's the method in my madness. Yes, I'm fully aware that there's a life inside my wife at the moment that kicks and responds, but a dad is alongside the mum is one that, you know, you're up late at night and you're doing all that dad stuff of putting the kid to sleep, and like I get to go home after work, and like my brother-in-law Jason, he has to go home after a hard day of work, and he's got to be dad, right? I get to go home after a hard day of work, and I can put my feet up, watch some Netflix, read a book, eat whatever I want to eat, and call it a day. So I don't feel, wow, it's at the end of the sermon time already. Okay, point taken, guys, wow. I just don't feel like I've got the ability to claim that right at the moment. It's 3 months away, but time's up. I'm just amazed it's not my father-in-law's phone going off. He's normally the repeat offender. Where was I? My brain's... on Father's Day, I understand that the dads don't have to do the washing up. So maybe I'll cash that in today, and I won't do any of the chores, and I'll just enjoy eating. Who knows? All right, if you have your Bibles, Matthew chapter 1, please. I don't know how I got given this talk, but here we are. In about 3 months' time, give or take a week, I think, I'm going to be a dad. And so looking forward to that, very excited. It's going to be awesome. I'm a bit nervous, I won't lie. But so I've done a little bit of research, and I'm thinking into, okay, what do I need? What makes a good dad? Okay, what do I need, Pastor Jagan, to be a good dad? And so I don't know if you're aware, but Australia, we do this thing called Father of the Year. Does anybody know who won Australian Father of the Year this year, 2023? Does anybody know? No. Hamish Blake. Do we know Hamish Blake from Hamish and Andy? Okay, Australian personality. He's 41, 42. He has 2 kids. He got Father of the Year. I'm a big fan of Hamish. I think he's hilarious. I listen to his podcasts and watch his shows. But here's the reality. Hamish got Father of the Year. He does all sorts of trips with his kids. He took his son to the Maldives about 1.5 years ago. Hamish is worth $4 million. His wife is worth $36 million. My wife earns more money than me, which is okay, but she doesn't earn 9 times more money than me. I don't have millions and millions of dollars at my disposal to take my kid to the Maldives for a holiday just because. Hamish, he volunteers at the moment at the local school canteen. He's a big part of school community. The reality is I'm probably going to be working 9 to 5 to put food on the table. I don't have a lot of money that I can, work with to be able to be as present as Hamish is. He has a TV show about Lego Masters. Maybe you've seen that. So maybe if I get into Lego, I could be a good dad. But the bar is set pretty high if Hamish is the standard. I don't think I'm going to be able to meet some of those things. Does that mean I'm a good dad, a bad dad? So, or will be. Some of the other fathers of the year include Mike Baird, who was the New South Wales Premier a little while ago. I'm not a politician. I don't think I would be a good one. Angus Houston, who was the former chief of the Defence Force. If they put me in charge of the Australian Defence, we wouldn't have a country. Steve Waugh, Aussie cricketer. I'm terrible at sports. John Howard, Prime Minister. Again, not a great politician. My eyebrows aren't as bushy as John Howard's are. I do like politics. I'm interested in it, but I'm not a good politician because I tell the truth. There's a long list of all these recipients that win the Father of the Year. Here's the interesting thing. On the list, it includes the year they got Father of the Year, okay? Their name and like how old they are. And then special notes, which normally includes like their profession. So they were, an entrepreneur or whatever. Nothing is mentioned about their children, right? Interesting for Father of the Year. When Hamish won the award, he was asked, how did you get it? He goes, I'm not sure because my kids didn't get a vote. My kids should have had a say. And I thought that's interesting because I don't know how much a 5-year-old and a 9-year-old would know about parenting. I'm not saying I know a lot about parenting, but I think I know more than a 5-year-old or a 9-year-old. If a 5-year-old or a 9-year-old gets chocolate for dinner and they get to stay up late, they are very, very happy. And we know that that's not the best kind of parenting. My wife and I are currently watching the TV series Modern Family. Have you guys watched Modern Family? Anybody watch Modern Family? Yes, no. The big kind of dad of the family is a guy called Jay. And here's some of his qualities, some good qualities. He's funny. He's hardworking. He's very protective of his family. He's respected by his family. He's very generous. Here's some other qualities. He's stubborn. He's very close-minded. For the most part, he's unemotional and unengaged. He can be quite condescending. He's homophobic. He's not up to date on certain things. If I want to be a father like Jay Pritchett, I don't think if I was to adopt some of those qualities, that would necessarily make me the best dad. If I look at the TV and the ads that are going out for Father's Day, get your father this gift for Father's Day, the perfect Father's Day gift. I'm seeing a lot of vouchers for power tools. If you know me, I'm terrible at anything to do with power tools. Voucher for car stuff. I'm not great with cars. Something to do with getting a big TV and a big sound system. We have an okay sized TV. Susanna's been asking me to mount it on the wall. I keep putting it off because I don't know how to do it. Something to do with sports, like a jersey or tickets to a game or a signed autograph or something like that. I'm terrible at sports. The only thing I really watched was the Matildas, and that was just 2 games. I couldn't really tell you what's going on in the NRL at the moment. A lot of it's just fake it till you make it and try and look like I know what I'm talking about. So here I am. I'm a dad-to-be, 3 months, and I have society painting this picture of what fatherhood might look like. And the problem is I fit none of those categories. And if I'm a bit critical, I can see the fault in a lot of those representations that are being presented to me. This macho dad that can build anything, that's not me. And I don't necessarily think that equals being a good dad. Knowing all of the sports and the sporting teams, I don't understand how knowing a lot about sports is actually going to impact how I raise and develop a child's character. All of these things are being communicated and presented as what an ideal or a good or just a stereotypical dad might look like, and I actually take issue with a good majority of them. And here's the reality. If I look at the Bible and I look at a bunch of fathers in the Bible, I'm actually presented with more problems. You've got Matthew 1 open. You should have Matthew 1 open. Let's just look at Matthew 1 for a moment. I'm reading from the NIV, and I think most Bibles would kind of have a similar translation. But verse 2, it says, Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah. Goes on, so we'll look at verse 6. Jesse, that's me, the father of David. David was the father of Solomon. Verse 7, Solomon the father of Rehoboam. And the list goes on. Father after father after father after father. And if we look at some of these characters, they're actually what I would say by modern standards and the Bible standards, they're not great dads. Verse 3, Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. If you look in the Bible, the story of Judah and Tamar, it's very strange. All sorts of weird sexual immorality stuff going on, and you can go and read it. It's in Genesis 37 and 38, I think. I could be wrong. We go down a little bit. So we have David, the father of Solomon. If we know David's story, his children are killing each other. Again, there's sexual abuse that's taking place in that space. They are trying to steal his throne. Hardly a healthy, happy, godly, functioning family. We look on a little bit later, David's children, Solomon, the father of Rehoboam, Rehoboam, the father of Abijah. If we look at Solomon and Rehoboam, they actually split the kingdom. Not a good, happy picture. Not models that you and I should look to necessarily. Verse 10, Hezekiah, the father of Manasseh. Manasseh is not a good dad at all. I can't remember if it's him exactly, but around the time of his reign, there's actually child sacrifice going on. Yeah. Now, I don't know a lot about being a dad, but if you sacrifice your kid, I don't really think that's a good thing to be doing. Just a stab in the dark. All up, it doesn't look good. We have this massive list of fathers, and when we examine their lives, they aren't exactly shining role models. Interestingly, in verse 16, if you look at verse 16, we see the flow is broken. So we have so-and-so, the father of so-and-so, the father of so-and-so. And verse 16 says, and Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. And Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Joseph is definitely a father. If we look at just church history and tradition, Joseph is a father. But here, he's not actually introduced as one. The reason being, when the New Testament speaks of Jesus' parentage, it goes to great lengths to prove and to demonstrate that Joseph is not Jesus' biological father, right? That there is something miraculous and supernatural about the birth of Jesus. That Mary's his mother, but that his father is God. But in every sense of the word, aside from biology, Joseph is fathering this child, right? In every sense of the word, apart from genetics, Joseph is protecting and he is responsible for this child. And in a long line of fathers and we'll look at some examples in a moment, in a long line of fathers who ultimately fail, we see Joseph, a father who is not the father, is presented and his fatherhood is actually detailed. For Matthew 1 and 2, all the events surrounding Jesus' birth, Joseph is the main character. And I'll prove that to you. If we look at Luke's gospel, it tells a different story. We start off, the angel appears to Mary, and there's a conversation that takes place between Mary and the angel. Mary sings a song because she's amazed at what happens. When Jesus is presented at the temple, and Simeon, he speaks not to Joseph, but to Mary about her son. When Jesus is in the temple, he says, I must be about my Father's business. Mary is the one who treasures these things in her heart. Joseph, in Luke's narrative, is hardly mentioned. He is just there kind of going along for the ride. But in Matthew's gospel, it's a completely different picture. Mary actually says nothing. She doesn't say a single thing in this infancy narrative. No angel actually visits Mary. Joseph is visited several times by angels in dreams. Mary actually in Matthew doesn't do much. For the lack of a better word, in this story, she kind of comes along for the ride. Joseph is the character who is interacting and hearing and listening with God, and whose actions are driving the story forward. And we look at all these characters in Matthew 1, Abraham and David and Solomon and Hezekiah, all these fathers that do wrong. But if we look at Joseph, who's included in that genealogy list, if we look at Joseph, I actually can't find any fault in him. And I'm happy to be proven wrong on that. If you look at Matthew and you find something and you think, like I'm more than happy to be wrong. But I just can't see it. For lack of a better word, he's faultless. He doesn't do good like these other guys and then crumble when the pressure gets too much. He doesn't take matters into his own hands. He doesn't think that he knows better than God. He's actually faultless in this story. And so what we're going to do is look at Matthew 1 to 2 And there are three scenes that Joseph is in, three kind of stories that we see. And so we're going to look at those three stories and look at three characteristics or qualities of Joseph. So Matthew 1:18-25, if you're there, I'll read it. This is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. Because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. But after he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from all their sins. We'll jump forward to verse 24. When Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded him and took Mary home as his wife, but he did not consummate their marriage until she gave birth to a son, and he gave him the name Jesus. So notice here how Joseph is actually the main character. Okay, it's his actions which are driving the story forward. But he's introduced to us in verse 19. He says it's because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law. It's an interesting translation. I said I'm reading from the NIV. If you have the ESV, I think it says just or righteous. NRSV says the opposite. This word that's mentioned here is the word dikaios, the Greek word. And there's a lot that goes on with that word, and I want to unpack it just a little bit. It could be interpreted as right or righteous or just or innocent, different kind of translations that we could get from this word. It's important when we're dealing with words to see, okay, how is this author, how is Matthew actually using this word? Like what's going on with his vocabulary here? And so we see a few different things. Here's what dikaios means or can mean. In its simplest of senses, it just means doing the right thing, as opposed to doing the wrong thing. Yeah? So for instance, the right thing is that when you're at a traffic light, you do not run the red light. Okay? You wait. When it turns green, you go. It is wrong to go through the traffic light if it is red. The right thing is to wait till it's green. The wrong thing is to steal the chocolate bar. The right thing is to pay for the chocolate bar, right? This idea of just doing what is right. No idea of like doing what's good, but just doing what's right, what's correct, what the law says. Yeah? Interestingly, in Matthew's gospel, Jesus is on trial and Pilate's wife comes and says, do not have anything to do with that. And then the word dikaios, it's translated often as innocent man. Now, Pilate's wife's coming into the story. She doesn't know anything about, the divinity of Jesus. She doesn't know anything about all these ideas. It's just, hey, he hasn't done the wrong thing. What they're trying to accuse him of, which is treason or going against Caesar, he hasn't done the wrong thing. He hasn't broken the rules. He's innocent. In its simplest form, it just means doing the right thing. If we look a little bit deeper, there's a relational idea to it. It can mean doing the right thing, but it also means treating people the right way. Specifically, treating other people the right way as image bearers. To be human is to bear God's image, right? You and I, we are made in the image of God. And this idea of right living speaks to this idea of we treat people the way they are meant to be treated as image bearers. And you and I are image bearers. To be human is to bear God's image. It's not a Christian thing, right? Whether you are Christian or not, you are an image bearer. You might just bear it badly, right? You might not bear God's image the way we were meant to, but you are an image bearer. When evil enters the world in Genesis 3, humanity doesn't stop bearing God's image. Humanity are still image bearers. So this is a really interesting idea. We have to treat others as those that bear God's image, which is we treat them the way that we would treat the image that they represent, right? So I would treat you as if I was treating God himself. I would respect and value you as if I was face to face with God. To do something bad to you or to do something wrong to you, to deface you, to slander you, to go against you, it's as if we are doing exactly the same to God. So humans, by nature of being human, bear God's image. Now we can really put the pressure on here just a little bit, because what that means is the people we don't like bear God's image. And I need to treat them with the value that they deserve. Criminals still bear God's image, and I need to treat them with the respect that they deserve as image bearers. Hitler, for all of his atrocities and crimes, was still an image bearer. Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy, serial killers that do terrible things, still bear God's image. I'm not saying it means that they don't receive punishment for what they have done, but it doesn't mean that they lose their value and their importance and their significance as image bearers. The temptation is just to treat the people that I like and my friends and to treat people that treat me well as an image bearer, but the people I don't like will ignore. That's not what the Bible here speaks to. A little while ago, Susanna and I went to Canberra, and we were leaving a car park one night. And I don't even know if you remember this or even saw this, because I was too embarrassed to talk about it. We were leaving the car park one night, and I went to the, where you pay for your parking, like the ticket thing. So I was there, and there was this homeless man, right? There was a homeless man by the, like where you put your money in or where you scan your card. And he was just sat there. And I didn't see him as I pulled up, but as I've went down the window and I've gone, I've seen him there, and it just startled me, because you're just not expecting to see a person there. And he's put out his hand for some money. And it was a combination of me just being freaked out, like startled and confronted. But I didn't say anything. I scanned my ticket and I just drove off. I just completely ignored the guy. That is sin in its purest of forms. A failure to actually recognize someone and treat them with the decency and the value that they deserve as an image bearer. I didn't kick him. I didn't spit on him. I didn't make fun of him. I just failed to even acknowledge his existence. That is sin. That is sinful behavior. Right? He hadn't done anything to me. The reality is I guess depending on the way that you look at it, I didn't need to give him money. I could have said to him no. At least I'm acknowledging his existence. I just acted as if he wasn't even there and felt terrible still to this day. Joseph is one that he does the right thing, treats people the right way. And there's a third little implication we can take from this word, and that is to identify and recognize the vulnerable and the oppressed and restore them. It's one thing not to run the red light. It's another thing to treat my friends and those I like and those who take care of me as image bearers. But it is another thing to care and love and advocate for the vulnerable. Interestingly, at the end of towards the end of Matthew's gospel, the final parable is the parable of the sheep and the goats. I'm sure you know it. Jesus lines up the sheep, he lines up the goats. And then he talks about the righteous, the dikaios, the righteous who God welcomes in. And he says, because you fed me and you clothed me and you took care of me in prison. And they say, God or Lord, when did we ever do that? And he said, well, when you saw the stranger, when you saw the fatherless, when you saw those that were hurting, and whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. And this idea of that those that are vulnerable, taking care of them and advocating for them and doing whatever we actually can to restore them is what this word is speaking to. And we see this in Joseph. So in verse 19, because Joseph, her husband, was dikaios, righteous, just, faithful to the law, and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. Jewish tradition required divorce because technically Mary she's had an affair or requires divorce. Joseph had every single right to do this publicly. Keep in mind the angel hasn't appeared to him yet to tell him what's going on. All he knows is that the woman that he's meant to marry is carrying a child and it's not his. He has every right to publicly do it. He has every right to shame her. He has every right to do so. It would be perfectly okay and acceptable for him in that society to do it. But he doesn't. He follows the law, but he also protects her, right? He tries to do it quietly. He tries to do it to minimize the amount of shame that she could possibly receive. This is not, as I've sometimes seen in weird retellings of the Nativity, like a Romeo and Juliet story of forbidden love, and he secretly still loves her and wants to, take care, but the powers that be won't let them be together. No, not at all. He is doing what he is required to do as one that's faithful to God and faithful to God's law. So we see that Joseph is a righteous or a just man. Secondly, we see that Joseph is a faithful man. So Matthew 2, verse 13 to 15. When they had gone, that is the Magi or the wise men. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. We see that Joseph is faithful where his ancestors had not been. Interestingly, if we look at Joseph's story, we see a lot of similarities to his ancestors, specifically the patriarchs. Okay, so Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If we look back at verse 16, we see that Joseph, his father, is actually Jacob. Right? And so we look back into the Genesis story and we see that who's Joseph's father? It's Jacob, right? So this similarity in naming. We see that in Genesis 12, Abraham receives instructions from God. So he receives the promise. The first thing that happens is he actually ends up in Egypt. Here Joseph receives some kind of instructions from God. He ends up in Egypt. Joseph also in Genesis winds up in Egypt. Here we see the New Testament Joseph ends up in Egypt. There is this commonality amongst Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob of wandering and displacement and being a foreigner in a different land, being somewhat nomadic. And the same thing is happening here with Joseph. He's in Bethlehem. He ends up in Nazareth. He ends up in Egypt for a period of time. It's hardly settled. And so we see a similarity here or a linking to the patriarchs. And we look at the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and we see that they actually, they're okay. God works his promises through them, but they're not these shining moral examples that are perfect all the time. Right after receiving the promise from God, Abraham ends up in Egypt and he lies about his wife in order to protect himself. He says, "Say that you're my sister, because if they know that I'm your husband, they'll kill me." And so then Sarah, and think about it, Sarah ends up in Pharaoh's court with the idea of being connected to Pharaoh now, and it's like Abraham's okay with that and whatever might follow in order to save his own skin. Interesting. Tries to make the promise happen early with Hagar. And then completely, the way that they handle that whole situation is a mess. We see that Jacob, he tricks his brother into taking the birthright. The name Jacob actually means trickster. Jacob clearly plays the favoritism game with his own sons, right? Putting up Joseph above the rest. Even Joseph's behavior in Egypt is somewhat questionable. The silver cup in the sack scenario. He holds Simeon in prison while the others go back to see the father. It seems like there's this bit of revenge-like behavior that's going on. God chooses this family, Abraham's family, to bring about his blessing into the world, and we see a lot of betrayal, manipulation, impatience, and deception. Hardly a shining example. And in the New Testament, we see God chooses another family to bring about his blessing to the world. And this new Joseph is completely faithful to God. Joseph does exactly what he is told, immediately, no questions asked. And there's this repetition that takes place throughout the story. Verse 13. So when they'd gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, and it goes like this: get up, take the child and his mother, and escape to Egypt. Verse 14. So he got up, took the mother and his child, and left for Egypt. Right? This he does exactly what is required of him. Nothing more, nothing less. We look a little bit later on in verse 19. Verse 20. It happens again. Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel. Verse 21. So he got up, took the child of his mother, and went to the land of Israel. This strict obedience to what God is requiring. He's not taking matters into his own hands. He's not trying to make things happen on his own terms. He's not pushing back against God. He's not saying, well, have you thought about this? It's like, whatever you say, I'm going to do. Where his ancestors fail, this Joseph succeeds. And there's a cool idea here. The patriarchs, it points to the reality that you and I, we are all flawed. Fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, we're all going to get it wrong. We're all human. We all have issues. We are all, you and I, we are incredibly sinful. We all make mistakes. Some of the mistakes that we make will have lasting consequences. But despite our sinfulness and despite our fallenness, God is still faithful, and his plans and purposes will continue despite our stupidity. Despite our brokenness, despite our fallenness, despite us thinking that we know better than God. The main character in these stories is ultimately God, whose agenda and whose plans and purposes are not hindered in the slightest by the brokenness of humanity. God will see what he intended actually come to fruition. And so you and I, we can take comfort from the fact that even though the patriarchs and these heroes of the faith get it wrong, God's will still happens. We can take comfort from that. But when we look to Joseph, that points to the reality that even though his ancestors struggled, it is still possible to be faithful. Yes, we might make mistakes, but that doesn't mean that we don't try. That doesn't mean that it's impossible. The Old Testament heroes encourage us that even though we make mistakes, God will still do what he intends to do. And no matter how bad we can stuff things up, God doesn't even flinch, or his plans aren't even momentarily halted. But that doesn't mean that we can just sit back and do whatever we want. Joseph gives us another example. It shows us that actually it still can be done. And lastly, we see that Joseph was submissive. So Matthew 2:19-23. After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt. And he said, get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel. For those who are trying to take the child's life are dead. So he got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. And so we see that Joseph is completely submissive and obedient to God's plans. His plans are done. His plans are dashed. He hasn't done anything wrong, but whatever he might have intended his future to look like is not going to happen. It's highly likely that Mary's pregnancy would be known by people. I don't think they would have been able to do a great job at covering it up. Joseph would either be perceived by the community as the man who couldn't hold it together until they got married, who just had no self-control. Or he would be perceived as the man who didn't follow the law by divorcing his wife. It's a lose-lose for Joseph. Either way, it doesn't look good. That type of behavior and suspicion would stick. We see also, and I've mentioned this, that he spends time traveling here and there. He starts off in Bethlehem, then he ends up in Egypt, and then he's in Nazareth. There's no settled, for the first kind of several years of Jesus' life, this fatherhood journey that he didn't ask for. There's no sense of stability that takes place. It's constantly on the move. And in all those things, we just see Joseph doesn't have he doesn't say anything, but he just instantly responds obediently to the leading of God. He instantly responds obediently to the leading of God. I don't know what Joseph planned for his future. I don't know what his dreams were. I do know that in the season when you're engaged and you're about to get married, there's all sorts of conversations and thoughts of what the future might look like, and this idea of dreaming and letting your mind run wild with all sorts of different possibilities. The future is bright, the future is open, and Joseph's excited. Mary and Joseph are thinking about what could be happening. And then all of a sudden, plans change. Any future plans or dreams that Joseph may have had are gone. Everything that Joseph could have intended is gone. Two quick stories. On Friday afternoon, I'd finished the day of work. It had been a long day. And this is just how crazy and selfish I can be. I'm driving home, and Susanna calls, and she's at Westfield, and we're figuring out what to get my dad for Father's Day. And all I wanted to do was go home, get out of the shirt and tie, and put on some trackies and have a nice drink and watch some TV or something. Just kind of like disengage the brain. And Susanna calls, she's at the shops, and she's like, what do we get you, Dad? What do we get you, Dad? And I knew that the good thing to do was to put that off and to go to Westfields, even though I hate going to the shops and carry the bags and walk around and help out however I can. And so I had this moment where I just was wrestling with myself. I wasn't on the phone. I knew what I had to do, and then I called Susan. I was like, it's all right, I'll come to the shops. And it's just this moment of the reality is it took an hour, which isn't that much, and I still got to chill out and watch TV and do what I wanted anyway. But the plans that I had didn't happen. And just points to, how selfish, even in the small things, we can be. On a bigger note, the intention for us was to be overseas for 3 years at least, and finished off study, and plans were over there. Different things happen and we get brought home, and just wrestling with the fact that these next 3 years are looking very different to what I thought they would and I dreamed about them looking. That's been a real wrestle and a real struggle. It's okay, mate, I'm almost done, I promise. I'm coming to it. The plane's about to land. That's okay, it's okay. This wrestle, and that took me months of just kind of getting used to the fact that everything that I wanted it's probably not going to happen the way I wanted it to. And in one hand, being okay with that. On the other hand, recognizing how selfish sometimes that we can actually be. And on the other hand, understanding that, my plans and purposes, it doesn't actually matter. Right? That's not the important thing. The important thing is what God wants to do. And so we see at the end, Joseph ends up moving to Nazareth. It looks like he's intending to go to Judea and to Bethlehem, which is where his family would be. But he goes to Nazareth. If you know geography and all those things, Nazareth, man, that word is tricky to pronounce. It's like the backwater town. It's in the middle of nowhere. Population is small. There's not much happening. It's like intending to go to Sydney and ending up in Tasmania or something. Sorry? In Borkham Hills? No, Borkham Hills cool. Oh, Blacktown. That's where I live, Pastor Jagan. Why are we knocking Blacktown? Broken Hill. I've never been to Broken Hill. Maybe that's a great example then. Ends up in a small town with a small population, and that's where the story ends. Next thing we hear, Jesus is about to get baptized by John the Baptist. And we don't hear anything about Joseph anymore. I think there's a reference to him being a carpenter later on in the story. The biblical story is not about a God who makes people's dreams come true. It is a story about a God with his own plans and purposes to bless his good creation. The Bible points us to the reality that where we get it wrong, that we get it wrong, and we think that it's all about us. And that when we adopt that mindset, we are doomed to fail. The role of humanity is to partner with God in seeing his plans and purposes come to fruition, in seeing his plans and purposes carried out. Whether we are a father, mother, son, or daughter, that's what it's about. Not our plans, God's plans. And Joseph, I think, models this brilliantly. God invites Joseph into that partnership, and Joseph gets it right. We see that he is righteous. He treats others the way that they are meant to be treated. He protects the vulnerable. We see that he's faithful. Where his ancestors had not been and where they had made mistakes, Joseph is actually faithful. He shows us that history does not need to repeat itself. And we see that he submits to God's plans and even gives up potentially his own. He recognizes that it's not about him, that it's about God. And if we look at these biblical characters, and I understand that it's Father's Day, but the trap we can fall into is thinking, okay, Joseph is the father, that's a great message for fathers. And on Mother's Day, we're going to find a woman, and we're going to talk about her, and here's a message for the mothers. No way. That's not how it works. These characters are represented to all of us to find some kind of connection with and be reminded that we too are not perfect and that we will get it wrong, but we all have a faithful God who's going to take care of us and see his plans come to be, which are so much better, might I say, than our plans. If my plans and what I intend for my life actually gets carried out, it's probably going to be a train wreck. But if I submit and lay him on the altar and look to God and say, all right, it's about what you want, something beautiful is going to come out. And Joseph adopts these, and what's the beauty that comes out? We see Jesus protected. We see in Acts, it's Joseph's son James who's actually leading the church, right? We see this blessed, beautiful family. Okay, not because Joseph's some perfect father, but I think because he actually gets it. It's not about him, it's about God. And I'm not going to make the same mistakes that those before me made. All right, let me pray for you. Dear Lord, I thank you for who you are. I thank you that you have good plans and good purposes for us. I pray that we would be humble enough and wise enough to understand and know that it's not about us, that our agendas, that our intentions they're not that important at all. That if we're left to our own devices and if we do what we think is best for the world, then the world's just going to get even more broken. God, I pray that we would have the humility and the sense to trust in you, to understand that it's not about us, to follow your ways, to be obedient, to treat others well, to treat others with kindness. And in whatever capacity we are here, as a father or a mother or a father to be, or a son or a daughter or whatever, that we all have a part to play, and we are all invited by you into the grand story that you are weaving, and that is far more important than any other thing we could hope for. I pray you give us the courage to trust you more. In Jesus' name.